let us get into demystifying ESOP program for founders. I also went through, all the registrations, and I did find that we have a mixed bag today, right? Some of you said that you all did understand ESOPs fairly well, but there was a larger number of you that said that there was a long way for you all to go in actually understanding ESOPs. So let's just, we've put down over here some of the basic concepts around ESOPs, right? So let me just take you all through some of this. So what is an ESOP? An ESOP is an option, employee stock option program that startups have as a way of actually retaining, attracting talent in the startup, right? As a young company, you might not always have money on your balance sheet to pay a large CTC or a large monetary compensation to your early team members. And you might have to balance that out by giving them some form of equity in your company. Correct? But the way ESOPs work is that ESOP has to be earned. So it is unlike equity capital that you give to your angel investors or your VCs. ESOPs actually need to be earned in a way by your team that enters. So it is an option that you give them of acquiring stock or acquiring equity in your startup. Correct? Now, to do this, you need to create an ESOP scheme, and at a ESOP scheme which will define the different parameters of your policy. Correct? So, for example, how long will the vesting period be, or how long will that period be before an employee can actually get any options accruing to him? What will the exercise price be? Will it be a nominal exercise price of just a few rupees sometimes, or would it be pegged to the last round valuation? For an employee who exits the company, how would you treat him? Right? An employee might exit on amicable terms, and in that case, what will happen to his ESOP? He might leave on unamicable terms, and in that case, what would happen to the ESOP? So your ESOP scheme, if you can think, is a very foundation where you have to think of really as a founder, how you think about wealth creation for your team, how you think about attracting and retaining talent, what is your philosophy as a founder in terms of treatment of your team members, right? And a lot of that thinking is actually what goes into some of the parameters that you will see in the ESOP scheme. As soon as typically in India, we see as you raise your first check is when you actually need to create your ESOP pool. Definitely at a Series A stage, if your angels have not already requested you to create an ESOP pool, definitely before your Series A investor comes in, there will be an ask for the founders to dilute and create an ESOP pool. And we'll talk about what the ideal size of this ESOP pool can be or should be, what we've observed, right? So these are some of the basics. You need to create an ESOP pool as soon as you are reaching your Series A level. If you haven't already done it earlier, you should have a formalized scheme which is approved by your board and kind of notified in that sense, instead of keeping it very loose on email, because sometimes that would lead to complications as your startup grows. You should have a standard template for issuing a grant letter, right? As soon as you have had a negotiation, a conversation with your early team member, you need to formalize that by giving them the grant letter, right? And telling them that this is the way in which ESOPs will come to you. There will be a vesting schedule that will be defined. There will be an exercise price that will be defined, and I spoke about that briefly. And eventually, you must also think about how will you give liquidity for this, right? So the employee has now got an option to buy the stock, but how will he ever see money for it, right? It could take place through a buyback, it could happen through a secondary, and we'll come to that later, so I don't want to go ahead of myself. But these are some of the basic terms that you need to familiarize yourself with, so that the latter part of this conversation could be meaningful to you. So now let me actually take this example and explain how ESOPs work. Correct? You can all see my screen, so I'll just go through it systematically. You've found the right person to say join as head of growth, correct, at your startup, Mike, for instance. And his joining date is February 14, 2018, and you've granted him 1,500 ESOPs. Now, typically in India, which is by mandate, there is a 1-year cliff period, right? What do we mean by a 1-year cliff? There is it is mandated by the Companies Act. So the first date of vesting or the first tranche of these 1500 ESOPs will come to Mike only after 1 year, correct? Which is the mandatory 12-month cliff. Now, after that, you have, for example, at your startup, as part of your ESOP scheme document, decided that the ESOP vesting will take place, on an equated basis, which means equal tranches, 25%, 25%, 25% over 4 years, right? This is a very standard, simple, no frills method of doing vesting. And we'll come to it in a little later, but there are different ways in which you can vest stocks as well, right? You could make it performance based, you could do it in different formulations, but a very simple format that we do see a majority of startups using is a simple equated 4-year vesting curve, correct? And you have set your exercise price at 500 rupees per option, correct? Which means that if he joined on February 14, 2018, the first tranche, which is 3,700 options, will come to Mike in 2019. And then in an equated manner, if he continues with the company over the next 4 years, over 4 years, all his options will vest. That means he has now the right to exercise them and purchase them back. Now, when could he exercise it, right? It is not as simple in India as it is now becoming easier in the US, for instance, and there is more method to the way liquidity takes place. But in India, still, there are a couple of situations in which this liquidity event can take place where Mike can actually buy or exercise his options, correct? One would be that there is a secondary sale taking place. So there is, say, a late stage investor. So now, again, we are 4 years, 5 years in, right? So the startup has grown. You're perhaps at a Series C or Series D stage. You're doing a large primary fundraise. And at that point, you say that, okay, let us also club a secondary transaction. And one of the incoming investors says, okay, I will buy out. I will do a part secondary of all the options. And we will, for a certain class of employees who have been with the organization for X number of years, let us give them the option of exercising their options, right? So that is one. The other option that we are seeing now becoming quite popular is buyback events, right? Where the company itself says, so now you're well capitalized. Like I said, again, you are a Series C or D company, you're well capitalized, you have a lot of money in the bank. And you say, let the company itself do a buyback, right? So let us buy back stock from employees, give them some money in return for the effort and hard work that they've put in over these years. Let them see some benefit of the rise in valuation that has taken place. And those stocks will, unlike going to an investor, those stocks will go back, those options, right, will go, because you're doing a buyback as a company, will go back into your ESOP pool. So automatically your ESOP pool gets topped up as well, correct? So now let's assume that this liquidity event has taken place. So what will happen in this liquidity event to Mike's exercise of option? So the company gives him an option, and in most cases, the quantum of options that could get vested will be kind of led by the company, right? It would be defined by the company. As a founder, as your board, as CHRO, CFO, you all will take a collective decision on, for different classes of employees, someone who came in very early. For instance, Mike joined you right at the beginning, right, of your journey. So, you might say that, okay, let us, for everyone who joined in the first 2 years, let us give all those employees an option to exercise this much percentage of their vested options. And you arrive at that number, which is 300, right? So 300 vested options, he exercises them, which means that he now gets 300 shares in the company. He becomes an owner of that stock or owner of that equity, right? So far, it was just an option that he had of owning that stock. Now on exercise, he actually owns equity in your company, which means that Mike will have to pay 300 into your exercise price was 500 rupees. That means that his exercise price cumulatively is 1,50,000. Now assume that, like I said, your company has really grown, which means the FMV per share is 16,500. correct? Which means you can see the numbers, right? He has made 48. That means he has to now pay. Now comes the issue around the tax, correct? So let me come to that first. But you can already realize the bump up in valuation that Mike has seen, right? This would be the amount that he will earn on this transaction would be a lot more as a chunk of money than he would have otherwise accrued just through his appraisal and through his rise in the organization, right? But there are two sticky factors that come in for Mike from an employee's perspective. And this is also something that you must think about as a founder, right? At the end of the day, is that in India, taxation on ESOPs happens twice, once on the exercise and once on the sale of the ESOP, of the stock itself. So now when he has to exercise his ESOPs, he will have to pay an exercise tax on the amount that comes to him. So 48 lakhs is what he gets. He has to pay an exercise tax on that, depending on the tax slab that he is in, right? It could typically be, a 30% tax slab. So he has to take that into account that not only does he have to shell out this money to acquire the shares, but he would also have to pay the exercise tax. And then maybe going ahead at some point of time, as part of that liquidity event, he sells his shares to a Series D investor at a slight premium, and he makes 49 lakhs or close to 50 lakh rupees. So I hope the concept of the journey of the ESOP, at least from an employee perspective, is clear to you guys. Correct. Now, these are some of the things that we need to keep in mind around the ESOP scheme document or the plan document, right? And these are the questions that keep coming up most often. What should be the size of the ESOP pool? Who administers the ESOPs in the company, right? What should the vesting schedule be? What should the typical exercise period for employees be upon resignation? And then, of course, transfer restrictions. Correct. So size of the ESOP pool, typically in India, we see what we call employee-friendly startups have a size of at least 10 to 15% of the ESOP pool to start off with. Correct. That is what we have seen as the industry average of the ESOP pool size, 10 to 15%. ESOP pool administration. The most hassle-free, easy way to do it is by the company itself. There is typically the board of directors that will run the mandate on treatment of the ESOP policy. It has to be adopted and kind of approved by the board. And then, of course, you also have, you could, as the company grows and the management of ESOPs becomes more complex, you could also have a subcommittee created to manage this, right? Which typically would have your head of HR, CFO, or maybe one of the members of your board, and you as a founder participate in it as well. We used to see in erstwhile companies that for a while an ESOP trust structure was quite popular, right? But we be perfectly honest, we're not seeing that a lot of early stage founders opt for this because it creates another entity that you need to manage, that you need to do compliance for. And therefore, we don't see very young early stage companies actually adopt the ESOP trust structure. Correct. Vesting schedules. Now, like I said, the most basic one is the 4-year equated vesting schedule, right? But there are many permutations to this, and you could do it differently depending upon the objectives and your thinking or philosophy around how you want to treat your team members, right? We are seeing that for certain roles, and as the company grows and matures, you might want to opt for performance-based vesting, which means that you set certain targets. Like say you're hiring a head of sales, you could say that if this person meets this CR value of target or performance in a year, then will he get the entire quantum of vested options in that year. And then you could kind of actually demarcate what those conditions would be. Correct. And you can do this very simply through the MyStartupEquity tool, and my colleague Pratyush will show you how it can be very easily managed, without going crazy on multiple Excel sheets to do this sort of thing. Some startups also choose for backloaded vesting, right? What do I mean by backloaded vesting? It means that you follow a schedule where in the first year after cliff, 10% gets vested. In the second year, 20%, third year, 30%, and then the remaining. This was and is used as a sort of retention tool, right? You don't want to give out too much of the equity early on because you're not sure if you've hired the right person. You're not sure if that person will actually perform and warrants that equity as well, right? So it depends again, like I'll keep going back. It depends on your thinking and your philosophy as a founder, what you have observed, what your experiences have been, and that will inform your choice on this. So backloaded vesting is another vesting schedule that we see some companies definitely adopt, right? And you could also have different formulations for different teams. You could also create additional policies if you find that your first policy mandated it in a certain way and you don't have the freedom to tweak it by a board resolution. You can even actually create a second ESOP policy to supersede the earlier one or work in conjunction with the earlier one. But we'll come to some of those nuances later, or if you all have some more questions, I'll be happy to answer that. The fourth point, right, on the exercise period for employees, when they exit the company or when they resign, right? Now, again, it goes back to founder thinking and philosophy. We have seen all ranges of this, correct? We've seen some startups mandated literally just to a few weeks or a few months, right? 2 months, 3 months, or even just a few weeks. And you can imagine that this becomes onerous, right? Like if I have to just go back to this example over here, imagine if you have to cough up 48 lakh rupees in 3 weeks to buy your options or to exercise your options. How many of us would be able to do that easily, right? It's difficult. I don't think most of us have 48 lakh rupees lying around in bank accounts to be able to do this. You would typically have to break some investments. You might have to mortgage your house. You might have to take a personal loan of some sort to be able to meet this, right? So when you create or when you talk about an employee exiting and the treatment of his options, that is something that you must keep in mind, right? Because at the end of the day, the person worked with you for 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. He already contributed to the growth of your startup, right? And in that sense, he earned his options, correct? So do you really want to be quite brutal in the way you would treat this later? Sorry. And then the other option is that you could also mandate that, this is not a free exercise period for perpetuity, but it would take place just during certain company guided liquidity events. And then within that, you can also mandate certain things. Transfer restrictions, right, on ESOPs that get exercised or stock options that come in. How would an employee, if he has to further sell it to a third party, what are the rights that he would have on those stock? Would there be a ROFR that is required, right of first refusal, before he further transacts on that? So all of that can typically should go into your ESOP scheme and should be defined so that you don't have any heartache later, right? So I've spoken for about 20-25 minutes, guys, and there is a lot more in this, but these are typically like the big questions that we see founders ask. But I do want to take a pause here, and if any of you have questions, I would like to take those up. I see that there is one. What happens in case where early employees have been assured ESOPs, but the policy is implemented after 3 years? Will these employees still need to go through the cliff period, or can we start immediate vesting? Grant date can happen only after policy implementation or post the creation of the ESOP pool. Exactly right. I think you've answered this question for yourself. You've asked me 3 questions here and I'll take them up. Yes, that 1 year mandatory cliff period will still hold. Correct. You cannot circumvent that, which means that for an employee who joined you in year 1 and you formulated the policy in year 3, correct, this employee will get his first vested options in year 4, which is why it is very, very important that if you're bringing in early employees and you're promising them ESOPs, you need to create your pool right away. You need to formalize the process and you need to give them a grant letter. Otherwise, this is what will happen, right? You cannot circumvent that 1 year cliff period, and the granting of option grant date cannot be backdated, right? Because your pool was not created at that point of time. There were no options for you to actually give. So you cannot backdate a grant letter. It is in contravention to the laws of the land and could possibly lead to legal ramifications for you, correct? And it would just mean a very poor experience for your early team members, right? Because they would have already spent 4 years in your organization and their vesting would start at such a late date. Now, I will just add a note that in some cases, and maybe my colleague Pratyush can jump in here because we have worked with some startups where there was this anomaly, right? Grants were promised on mail and so on, but the formalization of the policy and the creation of the ESOP pool and dissemination of grants actually took place at a later date. There are some workarounds, they are not optimal, but you could do something called bullet vesting, correct? Where you give off, but still that 1 year cliff still applies. But after the 1 year cliff, you can actually give a large tranche of vested options in the form of a bullet vesting, correct? And you call it bullet because it comes together in one big chunk. You could do that, but then again, it would kind of play some havoc on the ESOP pool, as you can imagine, right? You would quickly just deplete a large part of it. You would have to then maybe create a much larger pool. So for new hires that come in, you're able to balance it out. So like I said, not optimal. Pratyush, if you want to jump in here and perhaps give more clarity on this.
Sure, Sana. So basically, the bullet vesting which you're talking about is for, let's say, if the employees are working from last 2 to 3 years, and now you have planned to give ESOP to them. So the problem is, as you have already committed them that last year itself that you will give them ESOP, but still the ESOP scheme document is not in place. So you can give them for certain options, let's say 100 options, as a bullet vesting to them. Like bullet vesting, what will happen is with a timeline of 1 year, because in India there is a minimum cliff period of 12 months. So post which only you can give the ESOP to them. Post which only the vesting will start. So you can give a bullet vesting to the employees with 1 year timeline. So within 1 year they will get all the 100 options to their account, and then post that they can exercise it.
Correct. But like we said, right, it is not the best experience for an employee because they are expecting something every year, right? And then if they have to wait for longer, it creates that little bit of an ill will, right? Which you don't want to have with your team. Jovita, can you explain the exercise and vesting period again? Okay. So vesting period is the duration of time over which ESOPs vest to employees, so that they have the option, they get those options, right? And over here, typically we see of 4 years. There's a 1 year mandatory cliff, like I said, and after that we typically see a 4 year sort of vesting curve that people have, right? And so it could be equated annually. That means 25%, 25%, 25% over 4 years. You could also do it biannually, right, over 4 years. You could do it quarterly as well. Some companies even choose to give employees the vesting happens on a quarterly basis. And that is up to your discretion. But simple method is to do it on an equated basis annually. The exercise period is the period that opens up when you can actually buy those options as an employee, right? Or purchase those options, or what would be the way to say, to actually own stock, right? And the vesting period also gets defined in multiple situations, right? If you're like I said, if you are a employee that has exited the company, what would be the exercise period that you have? It could be a few months, it could be a few weeks, it could even be indefinite. Right? For example, Urban Company, with whom we recently created an open source ESOP policy, and I would urge all of you, in fact, I will share the link with you all over here. It's a very simple explanation of an ESOP policy that we have created. It's a legally vetted document for all practical purposes. You all can download it and just notify it and start using it. But Urban Company, for instance, has an indefinite exercise period. Right? At any point in time, an employee can exercise his options. But of course, there are certain caveats. It has to be tied into a liquidity event, right? You cannot just, or it has to be done by a board resolution, right? Which means that if I'm an employee and say my mother has cancer, right? I know I need a lot of money now for her treatment. I can actually go to the founder, I can put an application with the board and say that I have this unusual situation in my life and I know that my options are worth this much. Can you give me an opportunity to exercise them, right? And that is these are outlier situations, and the board would take a decision on their discretion whether they allow it or not allow it. And right, so there are different. You can go check out our blog as well. So I'm going to request Pratyush or Divyansh from our team to actually share some of those resources with you, Jovita. That will make it a lot clearer than I'm able to do so right now in a limited period of time. Okay, I can see a lot of questions. Let me go from down up. Archit, do you see performance-based ESOPs wherein typically the targets are achieved in 2-3 years and employees do not get ESOPs before the target, or is it that we need to compulsorily give ESOPs every year to employees? So if you have chosen a performance-based model, Archit, then you have to go by what you defined in that, right? And so you can actually define it saying that, if the person meets 100% of his performance or target, he will get that entire quantum in that tranche. If he meets 50% of his target, he will get this much amount. If he doesn't meet, or it is suboptimal, then he will not get anything. So that has to be defined, and you have to do it preemptively, right? You have to do it earlier. You cannot do it post fact because that would not be a good experience, right? And therefore, whatever you have defined over there, you will have to follow on that. If you're asking me, and maybe Pratyush can help out over here from what he has seen in his immediate experience of our customers using performance-based vesting, do we compulsorily need to give ESOPs every year? So, I mean, I think what you're saying is that can the performance-based thing be evaluated after 2 years? And if after 2 years that person has met his or her goals, then he gets, an X tranche of it. Pratyush, have you seen a permutation like this? And what are your thoughts?
So very rarely this
Very
kind
rare.
of
Yeah.
things we comes in place, because performance based incentive, how it works is basically it's measured on yearly basis. So what majority of our clients have done till date is they have either done it on a yearly basis so that an employee can get the ESOP and they can get motivated, and they will be also aware that what is their target and how much they have achieved. If you will do it in 2 years, then they will have to keep waiting, and it's not a good it doesn't make good sense for the employees also and for the employer also.
Yeah.
So usually the case is 1 year. Each year they get the performance-based vesting. That is, and that few of the company have done it.
Right. Can a grant letter be issued without an ESOP policy being in place? The one word answer, and I think the final word on it is no. You cannot grant, you cannot grant a valid letter. Sure, can you send an email that says this is granted to you? Yes. But is that legally binding? No. Is that the right way to do it? No. You need to have an ESOP policy in place and then issue a grant letter basis that ESOP policy, right? It is, otherwise you will go back to the problem that I described in the beginning, that the dates will not hold. What date would you put on the grant letter for the first vesting? Correct? If your ESOP policy is not in place, because your ESOP policy needs to be adopted by a board resolution, correct? And if the policy itself is not adopted, then your grant letter has no meaning, right? It has no value. So you have to have an ESOP policy in place. Can we keep the exercise price? Okay, sorry. There are 3 questions. I think I'm just going to take them together. Is it possible to do different pricing for different ESOP pools? So a later pool pricing is lesser than the earlier one. Can we keep the exercise price even lower for such employees? Or exercise price needs to be standard across all employees? So the treatment of exercise price is actually defined in your ESOP policy. Whether it's a nominal amount, whether it is pegged to a discount on your FMV, or whether it is, something like a rupee one, right? Just a nominal, which is the face value of your shares, or whether you're planning to peg it at a discount. Different ESOP schemes can have a different formulation on exercise price. If I've answered your question correctly. Pratyush, something you want to add over here that I've missed out or not understood clearly in the question?
So definitely you can have a lower price for the ESOP pools. It's totally the company call or the board call. Okay, so it's decided by the board or the company, and that should be mentioned in the ESOP scheme document. Okay, and the thing which has been asked is, yeah, that's all if I'm not wrong, correct?
Yeah, yeah. We had created an ESOP pool, but the policy is not in place. Can I issue grants post creation of the ESOP pool, or it can be issued date on or after creation of the ESOP policy? Pratyush, you want to take this?
Yeah, sure. So you have created the ESOP pool, but first you have to get the ESOP scheme document done. That is the policy. Without policy, you can't give the grant letter to the employees. And so even though if you have ESOP pool, but you can't give grants to them. First, you have to get the ESOP scheme documentation done, get it approved by the board, and then upload it in the ROC, and then post that only you can give it to the employees. And it can't be
Backdated.
backdated. It
Yeah.
should be post the ESOP has been approved post that date.
Yeah. Nagesh's question: what's generally followed in the industry with respect to exercise price? Is it rupee one or as per the last round value? So I think we've seen every permutation of this, Nagesh, to be very honest. Rupee one we have seen actually perhaps only in the case of urban company, right? That they have an extremely employee friendly policy where they've actually put rupee one as the exercise price. Just a note over here is that exercise price can't be lower than the face value of your shares, right? So they've kind of pegged it to that and they've said rupee one. But typically, it's a mix, correct? We see you could even just fix a simple nominal value to it, right? Like 100 rupees or 500 rupees, because you don't want that burden to be high. But in equal number of cases, Nagesh, we've seen people peg it also to the last round valuation, correct? Or a discount actually to the last round valuation, right? Like 30% discount to whatever the last round valuation is. But I will just urge you to think of it from an employee perspective and what ramification that has on him or her. It means that the upside gets crunched for them, correct? If the exercise price is high. So they see they don't see the full upside in value if they've been there right from the start, correct? Because they need to shell out a large quantum of money versus if it was a nominal exercise price, then they would see a lot more bump up in that valuation. So I would urge you to kind of maybe tread a middle path. Maybe rupee one is not for everyone, but maybe pegging it to the last round value is a little extreme as well. So you might want to find a middle path for yourself. My friendly advice, but your board could better advise you on what what you should possibly do. Having said that, it's also different strokes for different folks, right? Depends on the kind of organization you're building, the kind of sector that you're in, and so on and so forth. Lots of things go into it. I saw that there were some more questions that have come in. Perhaps while you pick out maybe the cap, I'm not sure if any of you are interested in the cap table side, but the product is dual natured. You can manage your cap table also in a similar series of easy steps along with your ESOPs. But there are two questions, so we'll just take those as well. One is why will the ESOP impact the P&L of the company? It would only be if the company is doing a buyback. Yes. Uh, it doesn't impact the P&L of your company in that sense unless you're doing a buyback of shares, which the money for which will come from your balance sheet. But I mean, if you think of employee retention, if you think of what it costs to nurture and build a strong team, and how ESOPs can contribute to that, then yes, I think that is closely linked to your P&L, right? The kind of policy that you have and the way you administer it and the way you give it to your team members and employees goes a long way, right? To managing retention and keeping your team motivated for your company. Administration and compliance wise, how manageable is it in case we choose to have multiple ESOP policies, and can two policies be implemented at the same time? So traditionally, I mean, why would you create a second policy, right? And I can maybe just talk to you about the cases where we've seen why startups need to create another policy is because perhaps like the first time they created it, they didn't leave room enough in it for modification. Correct. As the company grows, maybe the policy itself is not very scalable in that sense. Maybe, and it didn't. In the legal drafting of the document, you didn't leave room for it to be amended very easily, right? Except for through some very complex procedures. We've seen that happen as well at times, perhaps unintentional. Maybe even the law firm that you referred to or didn't refer to didn't advise you appropriately, and therefore it becomes difficult for you to amend an existing ESOP policy, in which case it just becomes easier to create a new one that better suits the needs of your company as it has grown. And even perhaps as your thinking around ESOPs has changed or evolved, and you now want to do it in a better, more robust way, or you want to go back and change things that are not easily amendable in the first one. Like you saw in the product, it is very easy actually to manage couple of policies, correct, that you have. There is, I can imagine that if you were not using a product, it might be a little rigorous to do so. You might have to, person from your HR team or finance, whoever is managing this, will have to spend a disproportionate amount of time in making sure that for employees who received grants from multiple policies, that things are on track with their vesting and so on and so forth. But if you were using a product like the one that we just showed you, then I really don't see it being too complex because the product itself does a lot of the back end management for you. Pratyush, anything you want to add? Okay, I see one more question. Two separate policies to give two separate exercise prices depending on the vintage of the employee, and because the policy was not implemented earlier, so that earlier employee benefit out of it. It seems cumbersome to my mind to create two separate policies just for the sake of the exercise price. I'm assuming that in your earlier policy, it is not possible now for you to go and amend that for whatever reason. And
Syna,
yeah,
can I add?
Yeah, please, Pratyush,
Yeah.
go ahead.
See, you don't have to have two separate policies. You can have a different vesting schedule. And the thing which you're saying is the exercise price. So exercise price can vary from department to department, or from team to team, or from employees to employees. Let's say if the employee is working from your starting point of time, so you can give him exercise price as the face value of the share. And let's say anyone has joined recently, so for them you can give it based on the current share price. So you don't need to get multiple ESOP scheme documentation for them. You can do it under one ESOP scheme itself.
Yeah. Just I think in some cases, Pratyush, like we have seen, I think the drafting of the ESOP policy, if it doesn't allow for change, and something gets stipulated there and it isn't open enough to change things, and there might be a problem in one or two of those cases, like we had also seen. But
Ye-
for most practical purposes, the drafting of the policy tends to be loose enough for you to be able to accommodate these things. So
ye-
you perhaps need to go back to your lawyers and have that verified. But in most cases, you should be able to do this, like Pratyush explained, without having the need for a whole new policy as such. Unless, that the original policy is so tightly drafted that it doesn't leave you any leeway. In which case, I would urge you to go look at our open source policy that we recently created with the Urban Company team. It's a legally vetted document, and you can look at the language and the flow over there to get a sense of how you can keep things reasonably open ended, so that as the company grows and scales, you have enough leeway in the policy to make changes. I think, guys, we're almost at the end of our time. So thank you very much. If you look at the chat window, we have put in your resources for you to look at, which are from the product. And even otherwise, a lot of open source material that is available on My Startup Equity that can help you kind of think through how you develop your policy and so on and so forth. And then, of course, if any of you are interested in reaching out to us and understanding how you all can start using the product, you can reach out to me. I've put my email in the chat window, and I'm going to request Pratyush to put his email in the chat window as well. And feel free anytime, guys, to reach out to us and talk with us and have your doubts cleared. We also do a lot of webinar sessions from time to time. We are also partnered with Mumbai FinTech Hub. So if you guys want us to do more of these through Mumbai FinTech Hub for y'all, please let Anam and the team know, and we are always available for anything that y'all might need. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.